Greetings. Welcome to the 30th Annual Mortenson Distinguished Lecture. I'm Clara Chu, Mortenson Distinguished Professor and Director of the Mortenson Center for International Library Programs. I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that I join you from the lands of the Peoria, Cascaya, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. While we have live streamed the lecture for the last 5 years, this is the first time that we're doing a totally virtual event. We wish to warmly welcome you and invite you to type on chat where you're joining us from across the globe. So the lecture is named after the Mortenson family, and it is because of their vision, which is librarians sharing information is one of the shortest and surest roads to world peace. Walter and Gerda B. Mortenson believed in this vision, and as a result, they provided two generous gifts to the University of Illinois to be able to fund the Mortenson Distinguished Professorship and the Mortenson Center for International Library Programs. The mission of the center is to strengthen international ties among librarians to promote education, understanding, and peace. Since 1991, more than 1,300 library leaders from over 90 countries have been trained by the center, the only one of its kind in the world. And I'm very excited that next year in 2021, we'll be celebrating 30 years of the center, and we look forward to you joining us. This particular lecture has been co-sponsored. It's been co-sponsored by the Mortenson Center, the Center for Global Studies through support from the U.S. Department of Education Title VI NRC program, the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, the Department of Journalism, the Mortenson Center for International Library Programs, the School of Information Sciences, and the University of Illinois Library at Urbana-Champaign. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our 30th Annual Mortenson Distinguished Lecturer, who will present the lecture. Then we will follow it by questions and answers. And as time allows, we would like to hold the last 15 minutes as an informal session, the way we might connect if we had a reception where people typically chat with each other and the lecturer while enjoying refreshments. Next slide. About Mike Thomson. Mike Thomson is one of BBC's most distinguished and experienced world affairs correspondents. During his career, he has interviewed many military and political leaders, including Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, Joseph Kabila, Ken Hussein, and most recently, the Liberian president, George Weah. Over the last 2 decades, Mike has memorably covered many of the world's most newsworthy events, including the devastating 2010 Haiti earthquake, 3 US presidential elections, the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, and the death of Nelson Mandela. His agenda-setting reporting has taken him to many of the world's biggest trouble spots. These range from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan to Somalia, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, Darfur, and the FARC-controlled jungles of Colombia. Mike has also carried out world-exclusive interviews with North Korean government ministers in Pyongyang, worked undercover in Zimbabwe, Libya, and Sudan, and carried out highly acclaimed investigations into such harrowing subjects as North Sinai's kidnapping trade, sex trafficking in Ukraine, death squads in Honduras, and Europe's sweatshops of southern India. Mike has won more than 20 major awards for his work. These include News Journalist of the Year, a Sony Radio Academy 2012 Award, Broadcast Journalist of the Year, a One World Media Awards of 2008, and War Correspondent of the Year, a Prix Bayeux Calvados Awards 2008 for radio. These prestigious prizes are in addition to 4 Amnesty International Media Awards, 3 of them in consecutive years, 5 Sony Radio Academy Awards, and 4 Foreign Press Association Awards. Mike is also a renowned BBC presenter, editor of the Raqqa Diaries, Escape from Islamic State, published in 2017 by Hutchinson, and author of Syria's Secret Library, published by Orion in the UK and Public Affairs in the US. A passage from this book reveals why Mike is fitting as this year's Mortenson Distinguished Lecturer and represents the Mortenson vision. He wrote the following about the official opening of Daraya's Secret Library, and I quote, "From this moment on, a new optimism took hold in Daraya. This literary haven offered more than an escape from bombs and boredom. It was to become a portal to another world, one of learning, one of peace, and one of hope." End of quote. Now please join me in warmly welcoming Mike Thomson.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Clara. And it's great to join you all, even if it has to be under COVID situation remotely. Now, most of us have probably never fought in a war and certainly not lived in a town under siege for years on end, which can leave us wondering how we'd cope with being starved, bombed, mortared and shot at by snipers day in, day out. You know, would we simply try and find a dark corner and hide, hoping it might all go away? I think I might be down for that one. Yet when this exact scenario happened to the people of Daraya in Syria, they achieved the almost unimaginable by not only carrying on with their lives during the long and intensive bombardments, but actually building a secret underground library, which they somehow filled with 15,000 books, a literary haven beneath the mayhem on the streets only a few feet above. So this is a story of triumph over adversity, victory of humanity over horror. Amazingly, though, the people who did all this were surprised that anyone was interested in their story. So when my book was published, first in London and soon after that in New York, they were both astonished and absolutely delighted. And 2 of the Secret Library's founders sent me their thoughts from Syria, which they'd recorded on their mobile phones, and asked me to play them to all those interested in reading this book. And I've turned their thoughts into a short audio slideshow by adding photos that were sent to me from Daraya during the long and brutal siege there. So I'd like to start with this. And here is Malik Al-Rafai and Abdul Basit Al-Amar.
The library was the place where we could break through siege barriers and roam around the world freely and dive into the depths of history. It made us forget the war and the suffering around. It was really amazing when Mike communicated with me and showed his interest in covering the story. Imagine that you live in an isolated place, cast away from the world. You feel frustrated, abandoned, and forgotten. This is life under siege. You want your voice to reach the world. You want the world to hear you. Then suddenly someone tells you, I'm here to help. It really means a lot to us, this book, about our story. We don't know who are the people who will read the book. We don't know your names. We have never seen your faces. We don't know your backgrounds. But we feel you. We feel your presence in this world. We are very grateful to you for your care about Syria. There is so much darkness around, but we feel there is some good in this world. And we feel there is hope that the world will be a better place someday. Thank you.
في ظل الأوقات الصعبة اللي كنت أعيشها بداريا كانت المكتبة متنفس بالنسبة إلي.
Amidst the hardships that I lived through in Daraya, the secret library gave me air to breathe. In the same way that atropine eases the pain of the chemical weapons that the regime used against us, the library was like the caring mother, whose embrace was the only source of comfort. The library transported me to a different, beautiful place. A world filled with stories, novels, and international literature, far away from the bombing and destruction. I sailed in oceans of history and geography, and through the library I discovered that tyrants never last. People need to know that what's happening in Syria is a struggle for liberty, by people who want freedom and dignity. Let the people who gave us Shakespeare understand that literature, education, books, and the library will be victorious against the machinery of destruction and chaos. And please don't forget about books, because they were our closest friend during the siege. In the same way the body needs food and water, the mind and soul need books.
I first came across this story when I was compiling a news report for the BBC on besieged areas of Syria in the fall of 2015. Now, at that time, there was something like 500,000 people living in siege conditions in lots of towns and villages right across the country. And I went on, in fact, to not just do the radio report, but also a documentary. You'll be hearing some clips from that a little bit later on. When I rang someone in Daraya, I said to him, how do you cope psychologically with being bombarded, shot at, mortared and starved every day? And he said, oh, well, you see, Mr. Thomson, we here in Daraya, we have a secret weapon. And I started imagining some giant gun that they'd hidden under camouflage netting and they wheeled out every now and again to try and save the town. But it turned out that secret weapon was in fact the secret library. And I was absolutely astonished by this story when he started telling me a little bit more about it. But before I get into details about the library, I'd like to show you where Daraya is in Syria, because many people may not be aware of that. We have a map here, which I can show you. There it is, just on the southern doorstep of the capital, Damascus. It's quite a small town. It had a population of something like 80,000 people, and it had a reputation for fine agricultural products, most notably grapes. The grapes of Daraya were famed throughout the country. And in fact, I actually found an article in an English book that was dated 1862, extolling the virtues of the Daraya grape, which was written by someone who was in the British Embassy in Damascus at the time. So he'd discovered the Daraya grape. It was a fairly small place where everyone seemed to know everyone. And it also had a very notable and long tradition of peaceful protests, right from the beginning of when the Assad family, that's Bashar Assad's father, Hafez, took control of the country in 1971. There was a long history of protests in Daraya from people who really didn't agree with a lot of the way that the family was running the country. And this went right up, in fact, to when the war broke out in 2011. And just before that, when there were demonstrations in Damascus, when the Arab Spring was catching on in the country. It was something that the people there took to heart. And when the soldiers first came into Daraya to try and stop the protests, a group of people there, many of whom were involved in later setting up the library, put flowers in the ends of the soldiers' guns and came out with chilled bottled water, which they gave to them all. And the thinking was here that they said, look, we mustn't treat these people as enemies. They're there doing their job. They've been told to come to our town and get us off the streets, but they're human beings. Treat them like human beings, and hopefully they'll treat us like human beings. Very sadly, the people behind this, or many of them behind this effort, were later tortured and either found dead or never seen again. So that is one side of the regime in Syria and an indication of what these people were so bravely dealing with. It wasn't long before the authorities started to lose patience with Daraya, And they sent in the military in 2012, in the late summer of 2012, and there are various accounts of how many casualties resulted from that, but it's anywhere from 200 to 300, which the government would go along with, to 800, which is what many of the people there claim, people who were killed, massacred during that period. And after that, those who hadn't already fled left, and the town went from 80,000 people to round about 8,000 people, but still contained many children and some families who were determined to stay on. And around this period, well, in fact, 3 years later, when I was chasing the story, I was given the number of one of the founders of the library, Anas Habib, and I thought I'll call him and see if I can find out much more about how the town is surviving the siege. And indeed, even more importantly for me at that point, was what's happening with this library? Is it all true? What's it like? Where's it sited? Who's built it? And all those sort of questions. So I called this number, and I was expecting an adult's voice, but what I got was a rather squeaky young voice, obviously that of a young adolescent, and it turned out to be the voice of 14-year-old Amjad, a delightful young guy who I was to come to know quite well over the next couple of years. And I didn't want to appear rude, but I said to Amjad, who quickly gave me his name, I said, Amjad, it's great talking to you, but I could really do with speaking to somebody in charge, because I want to know more about the library, and then perhaps we could speak later. Amjad replied, you are speaking to the person in charge. My name is Amjad, and I am the chief librarian. And Amjad went on to tell me more about his impressions of the library. And just before we get to that, just to explain, he only discovered the place when he was caught in an air raid and running around trying to find shelter, when some men in the street who knew about the existence of the library through word of mouth, because as it was secret, there were no signs to it, they directed him to it for his own safety and said, seek shelter there. And Amjad told me in this conversation what he felt when he came into the basement and was confronted by this treasure trove of books. Here's an audio clip of that.
I tried to memorize every one. There were so many good books that I kept skipping from one to another. Then I said to the men in charge, I want to stay here. It was a real surprise. When I first walked into the library, it was really exciting. There were so many books, some on top shelves that I couldn't reach. And now I know lots of things that I didn't before. Right in the middle, there's a table with notepads so that we can record borrowers' details. But I have my own office.
Describe to me what your office looks like. I mean, does it have your name on the door?
No, my name isn't on the door. It just says management. Inside, you will find 2 sofas, and there's this very small desk, just like me.
I just love his description of the very small desk, just like me. It made me laugh at the time. Now, the idea for the library all came about when people were seeing that books were just lying in bombed homes, many of them lacking their roofs and sometimes even some of their walls. And they were sort of rotting in the winter weather and getting scorched in the summer sun. And the people who were later to set up the library were mostly former university students who couldn't return to their studies because they'd taken part in demonstrations and feared they'd be arrested. And they cared deeply about books and had huge respect for learning. And they said, look, we can't just allow these books to be destroyed by the elements. We should go and collect them and put them somewhere safe, perhaps put them in boxes and make sure that they survive the war. And then someone at this meeting that was held in the street shouted out, what about if we put them somewhere where people can read them? And then someone else shouted, a library. That's what we want, a library. And then everyone started shouting, library, library. And they came up with this idea they would build a library. And they thought, well, look, we know that the Assad regime would bomb anything we hold dear. They bombed hospitals, which has been well documented throughout the war. And as this is so great, this would be such a great thing to give us hope and peace, they'd probably bomb that too. So let's keep it secret. We must find somewhere in this town, which is daily bombarded, where it would be at least a little safer than elsewhere. So they picked an area which was already devastated in the town. It was on the surface, everywhere was pretty flattened, but they discovered a place that was beneath a tower block, which had been virtually destroyed. There was a basement, and that was in good shape. They thought, right, we'll site the library in here. So they then went out and about looking for books to collect. And of course, this was a very dangerous thing to do because, as I said, snipers had a good view of most of Diriyah. These were government snipers. They were in the high-rise buildings that ringed much of Diriyah, and they could see from where they were when people came onto the street. So often, even crossing the street, you were taking your life in your hands. So they had to somehow go out and then get into these buildings. Now, many of them had lost their lower floors. Their front doors were now out of action. The windows downstairs out of action. So you had to try and get up the rubble, climb the rubble, and find a way in through an upstairs window in many cases. And we have actually got a video which was sent to me from the people in Diriyah during the siege, and it's one of people out collecting books from one of the very homes that I'm describing. And I hope we can see that in just a second now. And you'll see, here we are, look, there's people here from one of the collection groups who've gone out to a building here, which is fairly near the center of Diriyah, and picking all these books up, collecting them. Now, of course, as I said, it's very hard getting into these places because it's so precarious. One, making sure you don't get shot, and two, a bit of a balancing act on the rubble. Now you imagine what it's like coming out when you've got all these books and you know how heavy big piles of books are. You somehow got to get these books out without being seen or falling over or just expiring under the weight of them all. So these people came up with a very ingenious solution. They thought to themselves, look, the best way is to wrap the books in blankets, as you can see here. Fill a blanket with books and then sort of make a bit of a sack of them and then pick them up. And then, of course, you had to get them out of the building. And the easiest way to get them onto the ground floor, if there was a way out through the ground floor, which there wasn't always, but where there was, someone else would go onto a lower floor of the building. And then they could lower the books through a hole in the floor, as you're seeing now, and get these to people below. It was really quite ingenious, and it meant they could get thousands of books out using this very method. And they were books on just about every subject you can think about. They were from Shakespeare through to modern books on crime, to Arabic poetry, to biology, to politics, just about everything, even teaching and cookery. And in fact, many of the books they did actually use to learn how to help the community. There were medical books, which a young dentist in the book, who was only half trained when the war stopped his studies, he managed to get these medical books, which helped him to be able to operate on people. Because of course, toothache and tooth problems, they don't stop with war. People still have them, and sometimes they're incredibly painful, of course, as we all know. And so people needed to get to a dentist. Also for teaching, there were people in the book like Sarah, one of the people in the book, a wonderful woman who was incredibly brave and devoted to the children who were still in the town. She'd never taught a lesson in her life, and she used the books she gathered that gave information on teaching to be able to teach the pupils. There were also, in the secret library, they needed furniture. They went out and they collected shelves, often from the homes where the books came from, and chairs, and then put them on the roofs of cars, if you believe this or not, on the car roofs, and drove them using fuel they'd gained in the main from melted plastic. Now, I don't understand the science here, but apparently usually they're not always worked. And then they'd bring them back to the underground library. And all of these books, by the way, would have special serial numbers put in them because they wanted to be able to return them all to their owners when the conflict was over. They were just borrowing them. So each book would meticulously have the serial number, it would have the name of the owner and the address of the owner because they wanted all of these books to be returned. They also held in the library special classes on some were historical, things like on the London Blitz or the bombing of Hiroshima, the atom bomb on Hiroshima. These gave people a lot of hope because they said, here are places in the world which were shattered by war, but went on to do very well and to recover. And that's what we're hoping for ourselves. They also held art classes. And one of the keenest devotees of the art classes was a guy called Abu Malik al-Shami, who I nickname in the book the Banksy of Daraya, because he went around drawing paintings all over Daraya, which he hoped would inspire people. Some were actually carrying a moral message about how love is greater than war. There were pictures of children trying to instruct images of soldiers, not just the Syrian army, but of all armies, of the evils of war and the benefits of love and cooperation. And perhaps his most famous picture, and I think we have a copy of that here, I can show you, was a picture called Hope. Now, this picture managed to get into newspapers around the world, including, I think, the New York Times. It was a wonderful picture of this little girl standing on all these skulls, drawing this picture. Don't be confused, by the way, by the mask. It was pre-COVID times, but Abu Malik didn't want his identity revealed because people knew that if their town was finally overrun, then the regime would arrest people and you could be in for a very nasty time if, like him, you were a very vocal part of the revolution. And I did, though, at one point ask all the people behind the library, why is it that you spend so much of your time going around collecting these books and not actually, say, looking for food? I mean, people were surviving in the main on little more than a cup of watery soup, 1 cup of watery soup a day. And for months after months after months, year after year after year. And I said, why aren't you spending more of your energies perhaps going around looking for food or growing food? And it was then that I talked to Anas Habib, who I tried to contact earlier about the library. And this is what he told me in answer to that question.
I believe that the brain is like a muscle, and reading has definitely made my mind stronger. My enlightened brain has now fed my soul, which is just what it needed. In a sense, the library gave me back my life. I'd say, just like the body needs food, the soul needs books.
Now, one of the other things I wondered was, how do the fighters on the front line, how do they feel about all these young men and women sitting in this underground library, perusing Shakespeare or Arabic poets when they could have been on the front line with them? And I was quite surprised to hear that many of the fighters themselves actually really supported and loved the library. They also saw the people who founded it as those who would take over when the fighting had stopped. And they thought all the reading they were doing would help them bring the country together again. One of the fighters that I spoke to was called Omar Abu Anas. He was extremely keen on the library, and he told me how he'd come there wherever he could. And he said, not only that, but he said, when I can't get there, what I do, along with many other fighters, I collect books from the library in a little bag that I call a mini library, and I take my mini library to the front line. And there, on the front line, when it was quiet enough, they would hold book clubs in their foxholes. He said each foxhole, about 50 meters apart, would hold these book clubs. And although we only often had a copy of one book, we didn't have the same book we could all talk about, and many copies of that. We just have one copy of each book. Each fighter would talk about the book they had read and what impressed them about it, and then take questions on it, like a conventional book club in many ways. And that absolutely astonished me. And I asked Omar to tell me a little bit more about what it was about going to the library, about reading, that so captivated him. And this is a clip from the radio documentary.
الكتب أقول لك الكتاب إنتاج فكر لأشخاص سابقين.
Books motivate us to keep going. We read how in the past everyone turned their backs on a particular nation, yet still that nation made it. So we can be like that too. In fact, you can read everything in books. Reading and educating yourself. They help us plan for life, for once Assad is gone. We want something better than Assad. We want to be a free nation. And hopefully, by reading, we can achieve this.
When I mentioned the radio documentary, he was the last voice, Omar was the last voice in that documentary, the last one you heard. And very sadly, the very next day after the broadcast on the BBC of that radio documentary, a short text arrived on my phone, and it simply said, Omar is dead. Just 3 words, and that's all it was. And I couldn't believe that 3 words could sum up the end of such a vibrant individual. And I think it was just that the people who sent it to me, they sent it straight away when they heard the news, and themselves were in shock, and that's really all they could bring themselves to say at that point. At that time, this was now the summer of 2016, things were going from bad to very much worse militarily for the people of Daraya. The Assad regime's forces were closing in fast, and people were being pressed onto an ever smaller area of the town, and all the farming land, which previously had been in the sort of suburb of Daraya and under the control of people there and provided them with most of their food, these had been overrun now by the military. And things were getting really quite difficult. And I often couldn't get through to people there by this point, but here is a recording of a conversation that I had with Abdul Basit Alamar, and he told me what was happening as we were speaking.
There seem to be a lot of really loud explosions around you. Are they close?
They're being dropped about 700 or 800 meters away, as the crow flies.
Is it safe to carry on this interview?
In Daria, there is no safe place, so we might as well continue.
That gives you just some idea of what was happening all around me. And there was one occasion, in fact, when I spoke to Abdul Basit, and the sounds of explosions were so loud that the speaker distorted in my studio. That's how loud they were, and how near they were to the people I was talking to. And as time went by, it got so bad that I really could hardly ever get through. Only once in a blue moon could I get through. And I said to Abdul Basit, who was always so poetic and happy to write and record things in a diary, I said, could you record for me on your mobile phone what's happening around you? And whenever you get a signal on the internet, send that to me. And this is what he did in the late summer of 2016. Listen to this.
There is a plane over us right now. Just listening to this sound tears at my heart. Oh God. Now it's dropped its barrel bomb. We can hear the sound of shrapnel. Dear God, all that fire. The crops of wheat are ablaze.
When I heard accounts like that, it was very difficult to deal with, because there I was sitting nice and safe in London, and when I could get through anyway, I could call people and hear these accounts, and then I'd put the phone down and go home to my family, and these people were living in what must have been absolute hell. It was a very strange experience. And at times, as I express in the book, I felt a bit like a voyeur because of this. Although when I mentioned this to people there, they just said, don't be silly. What more could you do? Don't try and come here because you won't make it. And just said, look, you know, these things are just as they are. You can't do anything more. Finally, Daraya suddenly surrendered. The people in charge of the place, the rebels in charge of defending the town, decided that if they carried on, everyone was going to die. And they came to the conclusion that the only thing they could do was to give up. And it was then arranged in a peace deal with the government that people would be evacuated from the town in fleets of many fleets of buses, either to the suburbs of Daraya if they were willing to say that they disagreed with the revolution and that they would accept the authority of Bashar al-Assad and his government. If they didn't, which was the majority of people, they would be bused to the province of Idlib, far to the northwest, which was still under rebel control. Amazingly, actually, with their light weapons, which surprised me greatly. I did manage at this point to get through to Abdul Basit to ask him what he'd done that day just before he was evacuated. And he told me that initially he had gone to visit the graves of the friends and some relatives who had been killed over the years in Daraya. And after that, he went to his family's home, the home he'd lived in all his life, to say goodbye to it, to say goodbye, in effect, to his youth, to his childhood, to everything he knew. And then he said, I then went to the library. This is where I saved. This is the place I kept for last. This was the special place that I wanted to say goodbye to, the very last thing, very last place I wanted to go. And this is what he told me. And I have a quote here from him. He says, when I tell you what I did next, please don't think that I'm crazy or shell-shocked or something, but this is what happened. Knowing this might be the last time I would ever see the library, I walked over to the shelves and hugged the books. I hugged as many as I could. And while I did this, I cried. I cried a lot. Then I walked around reading the titles on the spines out loud and flicking through the pages of some of them. I so wished I could take all the books with me, all of them. I feared they'd be burned or destroyed in some other way. I'm sure this will happen. It would be so terrible. I believe in the books, and I believe in our secret library. And as it turned out, people weren't allowed to take any books. All those that were sent to Idlib anyway, they were not allowed to take any books at all. So they had to all be left behind. And what people did was they got lots of rocks and dirt and tried to conceal the entrance to the secret library, a bit like if anyone's seen the film The Great Escape, where the World War II prisoners try to hide the entrance to their tunnel. This is what they did for the underground library. I spoke at this point, actually, well, in fact, just after the evacuation, when they all were sent in their buses off to Rebel Hell Idlib, I got through to Anas Habib, and he was, at the point I was wondering, will most people outside of Abdul Basit, who was always so poetic and so sensitive, I thought, will the others, when they've got so much now to deal with, they're going to a place they have never been before. They don't know where they're going to sleep. They don't know where they're going to be able to eat, if they can eat. They've no idea what society's like there, other than it's under rebel control. Will they care anymore about the secret library, despite the fact they held it so close to their hearts for so many years? And this is what Anas said in reply to that. He said, we had a place of sanctuary, an oasis of calm and harmony in what seemed like a world gone mad. It's not only the books I miss, it's the place I read them in. I also miss the environment of the library, the people there. I miss everything about that special place. It wasn't just a repository of books. It was another world, a world we shared together. And while outside was destruction and pain, inside was creation and hope. Despite all that was happening, I felt inspired inside those walls. And of course, when they arrived in Idlib, what they found there was a very different society. They found people who were incredibly generous, who met them at the buses, and they all told me how people were almost competing to help them, competing to get them food, to find them somewhere to sleep. Some even moved out of their apartments and moved in with their families so that people from Daraya could have somewhere to live. But at the same time, they discovered a society run by a group called HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an extremist Islamist group, who didn't share their view of what the uprising, the revolution was all about, because people in Daraya had been in this little bubble, and they sort of assumed that all those who were against the Assad regime wanted what they wanted, that they wanted freedom of speech, that they wanted democracy, that they wanted tolerance. Although they were ardent Muslims, they wanted tolerance of faiths, they wanted tolerance of belief. And instead, this group, HTS, they wanted Sharia law. And those who spoke out against this would be arrested and sometimes killed. And this was a big shock to them. And they said that whilst Assad always remained their biggest enemy, nonetheless, this group was starting to come a bit close to that at times. Although they were given quite a lot of leeway because they'd come from this town that had defied the regime for so long, HCS gave them a little more room with their thoughts than they might have done for other people. But then came news that the secret library had been destroyed. And I was contacted by text and they said, Mike, have you heard what's happened to the secret library? Is it true? And I hadn't heard then. And I then looked online. There was an article by CNN, and I had tried repeatedly since the evacuation from Daraa to get into the town, to get into Syria. But unlike in the past when I'd been given visas, now the government there wouldn't give me a visa, and local people there said they think that was probably because of all that I'd reported on from the views of rebel people there. You'd always be Googled before you were given visas. But thankfully, CNN managed to get in, and they had heard my radio documentary, which of course was broadcast way before this book. And Fred Pleitgen and his producer, Claudia Otto, went in search of the library to find out whether it was still in existence, had it been discovered. And they looked for all the landmarks that people who created the library had given them. But all these just about had been destroyed in the constant bombardment before the place surrendered. And they were just about to give up when they saw some people in military clothes coming up some stairs from underground, from a basement, carrying large piles of books and loading them onto a pickup truck, in fact, several pickup trucks. And it's then that they thought this must be the secret library. And when they started filming these guys, they then got into these vehicles and left rather quickly. And they went down into the basement of the secret library, got to check firstly that it was the right place, and it was. It was just as people in my documentary had described it. They realized this indeed was the secret library. And they said it was just shocking to see the shelves ransacked, books lying on the floor in the dirt. That is what was left of those that had been taken by the men in uniform. And they knew later that these were books from the library because many were found on sale in Damascus, in the markets of Damascus. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, each book carried a serial number from the library, and it carried the name and address of the owners of the books. So there was no doubt where these books had come from and what the fate of the library had been. And I talked to Sarah. She was someone I got to know well who was a teacher. Well, she became a teacher in Daraya, had never been a teacher before, but she created a school with a couple of friends of hers there for young children and devoted herself throughout the siege to teaching the children. while the bombs were raining down and hoping to take their minds off what was happening. And this is what she said to me on hearing the news. I don't quite know how to describe it, but it felt as if the walls themselves were crying. Now that must sound crazy, but it's really how it seemed. In a way, it made me think of the film Titanic. People back then couldn't believe that such a great ship could end up sinking. That is the same as the secret library for me. It's the best thing in my life, and we've all worked so hard building and maintaining it. Yet now, it's as if it's died. Thankfully, the people of Daraya were never ones to give up, as their experiences shows. In Daraya, they didn't just sit there, as I said in my introduction, and just find a safe place to hide. They built this extraordinary library. And Malik al-Rafai, who I refer to in the book as Mr. Fix-It, affectionately, because Malik was always the one when I was trying to contact people and I couldn't reach them, or I was desperate for photographs or desperate for some sort of news after Daraya, both when the bombardment was carrying on at its height and later on when people were evacuated. And somehow Malik always managed, in the end, to find me whatever it was that I needed. And here he became hugely resourceful in building another library. This one was a mobile library. And he managed to do this by using the help of an aid agency outside of Syria that provided the funds, and then contacting a book dealer that he knew in Damascus. Now, this was the regime-controlled Damascus, so it was quite an achievement that he managed to do this. This bookshop owner managed, with the money that was donated from the aid agency, to collect lots of books, children's books, and get them sent to Idlib. They were children's books because HTS, the Islamist group I mentioned earlier, had a problem with many other books that they considered to be un-Islamic in some way or other, haram, they wouldn't allow them. And so Malik thought it was safer just to deal with children's books, which he thought even HTS surely can't object to these books. So he set up this mobile library. And I think we do have some photographs here of Malik and his mobile library. There we have Malik with the books that he put in there. And there is a van, an old van that they converted to be able to stack with books and take to the villages where some of these children hadn't seen books literally for years. And he said they did actually yelp with delight when this mobile van appeared. And he said there was such a frenzy of excitement as they went through all these children's books and borrowed them. And he said it made everything so worthwhile. Now, back in Idlib city, Abdul Basit and Anas Habib had settled down. And in fact, one of the really cheering things about what happened later was when I got texts saying that from both of them at different times, saying that they'd got married. Mike, I've got married. And they'd tell me all about this. And then, Mike, I have a son. And they would tell me of the birth of their children. And it was one of those really good news stories inside what was otherwise a very bad news, horrific one. But it's something which all the way through with this book, I found inspiration rather than desperation, or inspiration amongst the desperation. And here it was with them. And I got to talk to both of them about their married life and their hopes for the future. And Abdul Basit told me that his wife was as much of a bookworm as he was. He said she loves books every bit as much as I do. And we have a plan. We are going to return to Daraya and we're going to rebuild the secret library. When I said to him, Abdul Basit, that's a great ambition to have, but surely it's a bit pie in the sky because the regime forces, since Russia stepped in, they're pretty much running the country. What serious hope do you have of any time in the near future anyway, of returning to Daraya, which is now a ghost town run by the Syrian government? And he said, Mike, you say what you like. I am telling you, we will return to Daraya, and we will rebuild this library. Have no doubt of that. Whatever it takes, it's a promise. We're going to do that. And when we are there, I'm going to call you and I'm going to tell you we're there. And hopefully you can come and join us if there is peace by this point. And I'd like to leave you with a quote that Abdul Basit gave me around this time from Idlib. And he said about the secret library, always so poetic was Abdul Basit. He gave us a precious space where we could breathe hope instead of despair. It liberated us from suffering and savagery. Inside its walls, the love of science, literature, and ideas filled the air. This symphony of books soothed our heart. As we entered it, its aura revived us like fresh air to a suffocating man. It was the oxygen for our souls. It was a place where angels met. Each time I stepped inside, I flew with them. And over the 2 years or so it took in writing this book, I felt that I came to fly with them too. And it's been perhaps over 30 years of journalism, the most inspiring story that I've had the privilege to cover. And that's despite all the horror that there was in Daraya and the many, many deaths that there was there. And I really hope that it will have the same impact on you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mike. That was an inspiring story, not only as you've in the book, but also as you've told it now in this lecture. And so with that context, I'd like to invite everyone to a conversation of questions and answers. And I'm inviting everyone to write their questions in the Q&A section of this platform. And so if you could do that, but also we'll try to capture any questions that also come up in the chat. So we'll wait for those as they come up. And so Mike, maybe let me get started. And I know that for me, reading the book, by learning about the library, I was actually able to learn about the lives of Syrians. And I'm wondering if you know of other ways that such the daily lives of Syrians have been captured. Is there any documentation of conflict zones that you're aware of and the challenges that people face on the day-to-day?
Well, one of the films I've seen, which really inspired me, was the film For Sama, which was made by a woman whose husband I'd interviewed during the siege of Aleppo, actually, and they both came to my book launch in London and talked about pretty much what you're saying there, Clara, about all the things that they read in the book, which reminded them of their own experience of living under a siege, because Aleppo was also besieged, and about the way in which, despite all of this, people had somehow managed to retain their humanity. And it was one of the, as well as, they'd lost nearly all their possessions. Some of them had sadly lost their lives, but they retained their humanity. And it was something which he found extraordinary, and I certainly do too, that he said, it's when you're faced with such horrors and you're seeing such awful things done, and many people that lost family members, not just to bombing, but to the Syrian regime, they'd been taken away and sometimes tortured and never returned, to avoid becoming filled and riddled with hatred so that your world is soured from then on. And I can quite understand how it would be, and I've no idea how I would react to that, but it's certainly something which came away with me from not just the people I talked to, but from watching that film For Sama. It really is worth seeing if you get the chance, and takes you all through the day-to-day difficulties people faced, and also the humanity of it, the day-to-day way people coped with what they were experiencing all around them.
Thank you, Mike. We have Beth Stafford who's asked, where can we get your book? And I've put on chat the link to Public Affairs, and I think that that's for the US. For the UK is Orion, and I think it's also available through Amazon. Can you share where else it's available? I think you had said something about an Australian release.
It's released in Australia as well. It's also it's been released in Poland. I think it's published in Polish, and I believe in Japan too. So it's and New Zealand. So it's quite readily available. And in fact, I think one easy way. I think Jeff Bezos is probably rich enough, but I think certainly to say Amazon provides a way to buy this almost all over the world, really. So if you're looking to buy it, yes, you could go via Amazon, and a lot of the larger bookshops stock it too, and it's very well stocked in the US. It's one of the things some people have said to me, some Americans actually, oh, the trouble with our country is we tend to be very much interested only in our own affairs, and I found actually that's not true. There's been terrific interest in not just in my book, but in what's happening around the world in Syria and other foreign reporting in America, which is, I think, a great example to other countries.
Great. And some people have indicated that's available here locally at the Champaign Public Library. And I also have the copy of that's at the University of Illinois Library, so that I'll be returning. And so I think you will be able to get access to it. Barbara Ford asked, most of the photos, and Barbara is the prior director of the Mortenson Center. She says most of the photos showed men in the library. You mentioned some women in your talk. Were women involved in and welcome to use the library?
Yes, they absolutely were, and a very good question, because you could be left wondering, having seen a lot of the photographs, which have mainly men in them, and particularly because the photograph where everyone's sort of on each other's shoulders and they're having a bit of a sort of a good-natured tussle in there, those sort of occasions, they tended to separate the genders. But on others, women would come in and use the library. Initially, they had their own times for doing that, because within the culture, there is this separation of genders that I mentioned. But apparently later on, this was eased a lot. And in fact, many children who had been, both boys and girls, who had been unable to visit the library because it was quite near the front line. I mean, the whole area became the front line in the end, but early on, the area nearest to government forces was very dangerous, so children couldn't reach the library. But latterly, they managed to get there and often would actually sleep there because it was underground and seen as comparatively safe. But yes, women like Sarah and many of her friends were a huge part of the library. And they did say to me, she said to me, actually, I do hope your readers and those that come across this story will know that, yes, it wasn't just for men. But well done for asking that question.
Great. And we have Hal Southern who asked, how do you spell the name of the film that you mentioned?
I should expect an S-A-M-A for Sama.
Okay.
I have seen it with an H on the end as well, by some, but S-A-M-A for Sama. It actually was, I think, was Oscar nominated, I believe. I'm pretty sure it did quite well for awards. When the director, when she was there, because Sama was their child, and that's why it's called for Sama. That what they're doing was for the child. Yes, when it finally achieved great success with awards and things, happily for me, I think they'd agreed to talk at my book launch before they became megastars. But yeah, I think it's done very well, and as I say, well worth looking at.
Great. Robin Heller, who is a friend of yours and also a key person to connect me to you through our colleague Paula Carnes, and thank you to them. I was intrigued in your book of the rich history of Syria as the birthplace of libraries. Could you say more?
Yes, it was the place, and hello, Robin. It was the place where books were first discovered. In effect, I mean, there was a library there, a tablet library, so clay tablets, not actually books, more than 4,000 years ago. So in a way, it was almost like and these weren't just in a pile; they were kept in order. So in effect, it was a library. So it was really the birthplace, you could say, of reading in the world. So I think it couldn't be a more appropriate place for this secret library to happen.
Thank you. And Shannon O'Rourke Casali, who is the founder of Books for Eastern Congo, who has helped create many libraries there. Her question is, in your work in other conflict settings, have you seen any other library initiatives working to respond to the needs of their communities during war and post-conflict times?
Well, it's great to hear from Eastern Congo, a place I've spent quite a lot of time and is close to my heart. Yes, there are quite a few libraries around the world. There've been some in other parts of Syria where books have been saved. In Mosul, for instance, a library there that was saved from ransacking jihadis. All the books were taken out. Timbuktu, they were taken out and kept safe. And going back through time, of course, in the Second World War, there's some amazing examples where there were in the ghettos in Poland, there were libraries where up to 100,000 books were created in one of them, and right down to concentration camps where there were little mini libraries. Sometimes people might have 5 or 6 books, which again, if they were found, was very, very dangerous for anybody. And there's even a couple who lived, I'm told, in the public library in New York. They had a little space behind bookshelves where they'd some sort of abandoned room where they lived for a while and read many of the books. Astonishing story that. But yes, I think and indeed in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, there have been libraries created when the military junta was in full control. People created libraries there, little small libraries. One guy, in fact, created one in the capital in a little back room of an office he had there. And one of the regime people actually had discovered it through his daughter and came in there, and he didn't realize he was a regime member. And when he found out, he thought he was going to go to jail. And the guy actually said, actually, your library is very interesting. And he survived, as did his library.
Thank you. And I also wanted to share that Nancy Curry has shared information for SAMA. So then I've been able to add that to the chat.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Well done, Nancy.
So one of the things that you had indicated is that Abdul Basat is interested in rebuilding. So can you share with us maybe how we might be able to help in this effort, or where things are at this point? Well,
at the moment, it's very hard to go about this practically because of the fact that Daraya is still under the control of government forces. And I think some people have moved back there now, but not anyone who's associated with the rebel regime. It would be almost suicidal in their view to try and do that. And where they are now in Idlib, I managed to get books through. I've got copies of this book through both to Abdul Basit, to Anas, and to Sarah, and to Malik. Malik is now living in Turkey. He's managed to get out of Syria, and he's managed to channel books through people who go in and out of Syria to these people. So that's been great. But in terms of trying to get more books, and it's a great question, Clara, and I'm sure Abdul Basit would absolutely love it if anyone could get books in. I did at one point try working with a small charity to see if we could get books in. But at the time, it proved very difficult. There was a lot of fighting still. It's a bit quieter at the moment, so maybe it could be possible to get books into Idlib, where people are. This is the rebel-run province in the far northwest of Syria. But it is still difficult to do so, and it's not yet clear where they'd be able to set these books up. But I think perhaps if I could give you some sort of contact for me, Clara, and anyone wants to then write to that, I could keep them abreast of any developments in that if they'd like to help. And it's great that they do, because in the near future, I'm sure such efforts would make all the difference in resurrecting this library, and maybe others too in Syria.
Okay, great. So as you've been sharing your story in other parts of the world, what are some of the key things that people have found, inspiring, or what are the things that you've been learning as you've been sharing your story?
I remember an academic, a professor at in Washington, who sent me a message saying that he'd been teaching about the Middle East and a lot about Syria for many years. And he said, suddenly to me, Syria no longer seems a long way away. And that was like, in itself, was a huge compliment, not just to me, but to all the people who described what they'd been going through, described their everyday thoughts, not just the horrific ones, but the everyday things. Because it was a feeling I felt so strongly that as human beings, and it's an offset thing, I know, but what unites us is far bigger than what separates us, despite our religions or where we live or our languages or whatever. And this is something I found to be so starkly true. So many of our ambitions and our hopes, and it's the biggest single thing people have said to me, that they feel an affinity with people there. They feel a closeness to people there, having heard them talk at length, that they hadn't done before to people in war zones. Because there's a strange sort of thing that can be said, and it was something I mentioned in the book, where a woman on a train in the UK said to me once, seeing me reading an article about Syria from a newspaper, and she said, well, I suppose the thing is, people living in these countries must be used to it by now. And I'm thinking, well, no, I don't think anyone gets used to being bombed and mortared and sniped at and raped. No, I don't think that there's no getting used to it. And that people aren't somehow different. And when in fact, we heard just now from the person to do with Eastern Congo, I believe from Eastern Congo, there's been so much of this, so much trouble and so much violence. And nobody there gets used to that either. It's one of the things that recurs and recurs. And what people want so often is the contact with those outside, and for them too to feel this connection with us all. I mean, I was often asked, why is the West not doing more? Why is the West not intervening? Why, if you share our wishes for democracy, if you share our wishes for freedom of speech, and you too don't like this government that rules over us, why don't you help us? And I tried to explain about conflicts before and what's happened in places like Libya and of course in Iraq, which in the US and the UK we've been heavily involved in, our own countries have been heavily involved in militarily, and then seen the terrible things that have followed. There was a reticence to get involved. And I mentioned it was complicated, and then the word complicated didn't go down well. They say, it's not complicated, we're dying, we need help. But in the end, they came to agree that in some ways it is complicated for governments. And they said, anyway, we don't blame people like you, we don't blame the people in your country or the people in America, we blame the politicians. They're the ones that don't do things. And they probably don't listen to all of you anyway, just like our government doesn't listen to us. Although I think our governments are a bit more accountable.
Great. So we have Paula Carnes who would like to ask a question. So you can turn on your mic, Paula.
Oh, I just want to say how proud you make me, hello Mike, to be a librarian, and to all of us who are on the call as librarians. You know, we often go about our lives in rather mundane ways and think about, oh, I have to buy this book, and oh, I have these patrons, you know, to answer reference questions for, and not thinking how noble this profession is. And so you remind me of that. And of course, you know, in the US, we're working in very much different conditions, but it's wonderful to hear that across the world, other people care as deeply as we do about books. So thank you so much.
Well, Paula, thank you for your comments. And you to so many people that I've been talking to for ages in Syria are the sort of, I looked up to as heroes by people for the work that you do, which often, as you said, may seem mundane, but so important. In my own country, for instance, so many libraries, public libraries, are being shut down because governments are looking for ways to cut costs, and libraries have been falling by the wayside and closed, or at least their hours trimmed radically. And it's so sad to see when you look at how valuable they are to so many people, not even for people who might not go all that often, but as repositories of knowledge and culture and art and science. They're just wonderful places. And you do you and your profession do a fantastic job. And I'm so glad if you are getting a little bit more recognition now, because you deserve it.
Thank you, Mike. And then from Thomas Ulen, he says, this has been so marvelous that I would love to be able to share it with friends and family. Do you know where and when the recording will be posted? So I guess I can address that one. The recording will be posted, we'll send an email out to all who have registered, and then it will also be posted from our website. So where you found the main information, that's where you'll be able to see it. Right.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So unless there's a final question, maybe I'll end with the final question before we open it up and have, an informal setting where just people can talk about anything and then just catch up and connect. And that is that the library is a place where not only you read, but you engage with each other in ideas. And I'm wondering, first, I guess, the literacy level of Syrians and therefore their ability to engage with the book and reading. And then the other is whether the library was more a quiet place for reading, or were there lively discussions and so forth?
Great. Well, a good couple of questions there. Yes. The literacy level amongst the people who set up the library was, of course, very good, because most of them were university students. And across the board, it's actually quite high in Syria. But obviously, with the terrible turmoil that the war has caused, you've got many people whose education has been completely ruined for many years now. And right back to 2011. So we're talking sort of coming on 9 years. So you do have quite a few fighters, for instance, some of whom I mentioned with the secret library, who were defending Daraya. They were quite anti the place because many of them couldn't read well, some hardly at all. And that's something that's come about through the war, because previously they could, although a lot of books in schools have long been censored, they just wouldn't be there for students to read. Nonetheless, there was quite a decent education system. As for the library itself, yes, there was so much more than reading. There were all these talks that were held. There were, for instance, English language classes. There were classes in reading for those who were struggling a bit with that. There were lectures on a wide variety of subjects, from the ones I mentioned earlier about the Blitz in London and Hiroshima in Japan, right through to all sorts of things. Somebody might give a talk if they're an expert on snakes. They might give a talk about that. Every day there was some sort of class on something, and people, and even there are even talks on the theatre, on the arts, on painting, demonstrations on cookery, just about everything you could think of, really. They were things which filled those gaps, and they were things which also would draw people in from the community who maybe were less keen on reading than some others, but had interest in wider things, and they hoped then to draw them into the books as well.
And so, as you can see in this slide, there will be libraries from across the world that will be receiving a copy of Syria's secret library. This copy of the book will be added to their collections, as well as they plan to do particular programming around the book and the subject matter. And so we're glad that we're able to make this possible, that the story that Mike has written is going to be shared, and that the story of really, people who are in difficult circumstances have found a way of hope and have found connections with each other. And so we're glad that we're able to facilitate this process. And so before we turn off the recording and just have time to just chat with each other, I want to thank again the co-sponsors for this lecture. And in particular, many people that are behind the scenes, in particular, Katie Ebling, who's our office support specialist, and Andrew Stengili, who is our technology video expert. And so with their help, it's been wonderful to put this all together. And others who are doing other kinds of work at the library to support this. And then most importantly to you, Mike, for having the time to come and share with us and spend it with us. We hope that we'll have a chance to meet you in person at some point. And we have so much appreciated having you. And so we'll stop the recording now, and please stick around for everyone to have the opportunity to connect. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.